Pakistan's agricultural sector is one of the leading sectors in terms of GDP contribution. It contributes over 19% to the country's gross domestic product and employs almost 40% of the population. However, the farmers are very much at the base of the pyramid. You've written a book on Pakistan's agricultural political economy. It's titled as Development, Poverty and Power in Pakistan. And here I would like to ask you, what were your findings in the book?
There is urbanization, but that urbanization is also unsustainable. We have a lot of slum areas, not the kind of urbanization that we've seen sort of in the Western world, where imperialism, colonization aided that process. Of course, it was fueled by raw material and labor. When there was subsidization for purchasing tractors, seed was becoming more expensive, you did see the first major wave in Pakistan of depeasantization. So, now you did not need 100 sharecroppers because managing 100 poor people, even in an exploitative way, is a headache. When the military has a sizable interest in agricultural land, when feudal families over time have, changed sort of where they draw the power from. But in the last several decades, you've had this irony. Was it Fanon who said to rule over land is to rule over people? Because when you did have these large parcels of land and, villages living there, I mean, those were captive vote banks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Naurain Rana, and I'm an economist with the World Bank. I'll be hosting today's program on a new wave where we will be talking about rural poverty and the issue with agricultural development in Pakistan. And joining me today to speak on the topic is a very esteemed guest. I would like to introduce and welcome Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali, who's a development anthropologist and is based in Washington, D.C. He's an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and American University as well, and is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. Welcome, Muhammad Ali. Thank you so much for joining us and having this discussion.
Pleasure.
So without further ado, I'll just lay the ground of our discussion. Pakistan's agricultural sector is one of the leading sectors in terms of GDP contribution. It contributes over 19% to the country's gross domestic product and employs almost 40% of the population. However, the farmers are very much at the base of the pyramid. There's a rampant rural poverty, and our workforce tends to operate informally, is subjected to exploitative practices by landed elites. Additionally, our agricultural productivity is one of the lowest in the world. Despite our claims that we are an agrarian economy, there are various gaps. We're faltering at various stages. If we look at the supply chain, we do not have warehouse capacities, there's lack of cold storages, there's lack of transportation, which hinders not just our productivity, but also puts our farmers in a conundrum where they are, at the end of the day, being exploited due to lack of credible infrastructure. And you've written a book on the very same topic. It covers Pakistan's agricultural political economy. It's titled as Development, Poverty and Power in Pakistan. And here I would like to ask you, what were your findings in the book? And how can we address these issues that I've just laid out, given the fact that agriculture is still the backbone of the country's economy?
It absolutely is. If you think of labor force absorption, we still have a sizable number of able-bodied people, men and women, working in agriculture. Yes, there is urbanization, but that urbanization is also unsustainable. We have a lot of slum areas. It's not the kind of urbanization that we've seen sort of in the Western world, where the imperialism, colonization aided that process. Of course, it was fueled by raw material and labor. But nonetheless, I mean, there was rampant industrialization. So you had a situation in Western countries here in the US where you have 2 or 3% or less of the population growing more food than the US needs, and which is dumped onto markets in the global south. So we are not in that situation, right? I mean, uh, we've also had various waves of depeasantization over time. And so I wanted to take a long view in my work, because it was actually coming out of my thesis, which then turned into a book. And I was, interested in looking at this political economy of the agrarian sector, right? And it comes, on the back of already. Let's not go into the Mansabdari system. I mean, the Mansabdari system was actually, it was more statist, if you
Mhm.
will, the way
Yeah.
that the administration had been
Yeah.
set up. But when the British came in, and this is like, the laws of diminishing return and these kinds of political theories were coming to the fore, and they thought that, this idea of proprietorship would be, useful to boost yields. And a lot of other people have, of course, done work on this, from the economic historical perspective. Imran Ali's book on agricultural colonialism, and they sort of reified this, peasantry, and the idea was that they're going to come in from, different parts of the Punjab, because they had invested
Yeah.
heavily in the canal economies. And when these peasants came in, there were certain conditions that they had to meet in order to get access to that land. And alongside that, we also saw the Ghoda Pal scheme. We saw the dairy farm. So basically military,
Mm.
involvement in agriculture. So, that is something that the post-colonial state, of course, has also, has followed that precedent. And that precedent had, it had political consequences. If you look at the 1857 mutiny, or slash war of independence, it didn't take hold because there was the peasantry in the Punjab did not rise up, because to a
Yeah.
certain degree, those in positions of affluence had been placated to a certain
Yeah.
degree. So,
Yeah.
there are long-term consequences. And of course, the hydrological development that took place with the canal economies and subsequent damming has had, the ecological impacts that it has had. But this is not only, we're not going back a century and a half necessarily. I mean, even if you look at the Green Revolution,
Yeah.
right? And these things are complex, because you had a situation, this sort of burgeoning population in countries like Pakistan, and this idea, back in the 50s and 60s, when the concept of sort of ecological preservation had not been on anyone's radar. And USAID became a big proponent of
Mm.
basically using high yield variety, of using chemical fertilizer,
Fertilizer.
pesticide, and mechanics like tractors, which then created, and in Pakistan by the 70s, you had the Bhutto government. Yes, it had come in and said, like, the land reforms are going to be by family
Yeah.
unit rather than individuals, and there was a lot of sort of maneuvering around that
Mm.
to keep large parcels of land intact. But at the same time, when there was subsidization for purchasing tractors, seed was becoming more expensive, you did see the first major wave in Pakistan of depeasantization. So, now you did not need 100 sharecroppers,
Mm.
because managing 100 poor people, even
Mm.
in an exploitative way, is a headache, right? I mean, you have to
Yeah.
provide them, advice regarding what to grow, or tell them what to grow, share the cost of inputs, and then, have this kind of paternalistic relationship, which can involve having their
Mm.
children or wives working in your house, but then also giving them, a social safety net. I mean, when there's sickness or an emergency. So managing so many people has always been tricky. And that's why over time we have seen not only depeasantization, but we have also seen, an increasing trend towards leasing, right? Like rather
Yeah.
than sharecropping. But sharecropping, while it was historically exploitative, it gave an opportunity to farmers to have access to a piece of land, right? Even if they had to give a sizable amount, proportion, depending on how much they had borrowed and how much they had gotten in terms of inputs, they had to give away a large size of their harvest, was still a better arrangement than than leasing for poorer
Mm.
farmers, because a poor farmer does not have the cash up front to rent a piece of land, to spend all the agri inputs that are needed on it, and take that risk of a drought or a
Mm.
flood or pest infestation in the crops. So essentially, then you had people who had some economic means taking on leasing, and the rest just fell into either they left the rural areas, or tried to see whatever they could find in cottage industry, whatever else was around, or became daily wage laborers, right? The khet mazdoor.
Yeah.
So
And
so that
if I may come here, like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think the middleman, as to simply put in terms, is also where he found his value, because of the fact that harvesting in Pakistan is very seasonal, and there's a very limited time window in which the farmer has the ability to sell what he's reaped. And that time window is exploited due to, like I initially mentioned, lack of infrastructure capabilities that allows, or that would enable that farmer to store and sell at a price which merits a decent wage, a decent rate. And that, linking to the part where you initially started off saying that there's been a lot of urbanization in Pakistan, and that urbanization has got to do a lot with internal migration as well. Population growth, one, and internal migration. And that has been uncontrollable migration, because we did not grow as structural transformation happens when there's a switch from agricultural activities to more industrialization. Industrialization really did not happen at the same rate at the rate urbanization happened, because rural poverty has been growing, still continues to grow.
yeah. And on this idea of sort of what to do with the crops when they are grown. I mean, of course, there is limited capacity. I mean, for a farmer, it's a risk when they don't have
Mm.
grain silos, etc. They have to sell it soon. But if you look at the Vardana system, like the wheat, subsidy that is justified in the name of food security, I mean, there's all sorts of problems around that. We won't get into
Mm.
the sugar, which is also quite amusing. Um, However, with wheat, for instance, the idea is that the government is going to provide an assured rate, and farmers will come and sell their grain. Now, when you're a poorer farmer, you don't have the ability to do the smallest things, like to take your grain, from your farm to several
Absolutely.
kilometers
Yeah.
away,
Yeah.
where the government is doing the procurement. You don't have the capacity to hang on and wait for a government check to be cashed,
Mm.
right? And what do you do in the interim, right? I mean, when you have your urgent needs, so often you'll see middlemen come in there also,
Mm.
right? So they have been, although
Yeah.
the government tries to push the middleman out of the side, but the arti basically,
Mm.
right? So they will, because they are the ones who are providing cash during the year to poorer farmers, and they will pick up their grain from the doorstep, bring it, and then sell it for a higher rate to the government at the assured price, and pocket the change, right? So that's the kind of cost of doing business. So you have, so you, even when you have attempts to subsidize, and these are, of course, not the landless poor. These are not the agri workers. These are not the seasonal workers
Mm.
who go and pick cotton and then go and go to Sargodha and pick citrus and keep moving like that, or do the weeding and stuff like that, pre-harvest. So, there's that large chunk of that's the real rural poor. And then you have, situations where there are very small parcels of land, which are also then economically unproductive because of land fragmentation, intergenerational, and now they're struggling with things like climate change. And it seems that, there has not been a very concerted effort which can look at all these stresses, these, increasingly burdensome stresses, and try and approach this problem from the bottom up, right? So there's been, and the market mechanism has also been quite, futile in addressing asymmetrical markets, for instance. So, I mean, Akmal Hussain and they've done work on, how power relations, etc., create these asymmetries. And the example I just gave you about a poor wheat farmer, that is the way in which they are essentially paying more for inputs, because when they purchase from an RP upfront, they're kind of paying an interest. When they go and want to sell, they are not even getting the state-determined rate for their wheat, right? So for them, because of their desperations, because of these structural reasons, because of the fact that they don't own often access to capital, it makes, the market mechanism does not treat them fairly. So there are all these issues, but Pakistan has not been able to, come to grips with these issues thus far.
And now what we're seeing is that I wouldn't say it's a new player, but the military establishment, for example, it is over the recent years is more and more so finding its footing in this sector, this concept of corporate farming, which you're much more well aware of. How does their influence, how does their involvement now change the dynamics? Because some decades back, it was run by feudal elites, also known as landed elites, and now we have this institution which is like other sectors of the economy is now becoming a key stakeholder here as well.
So I've had a chance to sort of go and spend some time because being a development anthropologist and the degree I was doing, so I did spend quite some time at one of the leading corporate farms in Pakistan a few years ago now, but. The kind of model it had set up, and here it's not just corporate farms within Pakistan. Actually, a lot of the momentum for this has come from entities like the World Bank. So, back in 2006, I was a fellow with the Open Society Institute in Budapest. And I was looking at the issue of participation in the poverty reduction strategy paper, right, for a couple of years. And I looked at it specifically in Pakistan, but also traveled, to sort of different countries. And in the party, which you'll probably be familiar with, was used, that kind of an approach emerging out of Joseph Stiglett's critique of country ownership, lack of country ownership, and structural adjustment, one size fits all, right? And he was, of course, the Nobel Prize winning chief economist at the World Bank. And then in 1999 at their spring meeting, they sort of launched the poverty reduction strategy paper approach, IMF and World Bank, and there were lots of issues around that, the glass ceiling and how come Uganda's poverty reduction strategy paper looked very similar to Pakistan's and Nepal's. Everyone talking about microfinance as the way to alleviate poverty, etc.
Yeah.
But one of the issues in there was corporate farming, for instance, right? And I mean, it comes at it from sort of those efficiency arguments that if you look at, the amount of available land, the water stress, these kinds of issues need, you need economies of scale, you need technological input, and the corporate sector, of course, has the resources to manage these processes.
Yeah.
But what happens is, I mean, I was surprised to see corporate farming mentioned in the poverty reduction strategy paper, because the farm that I went to, had a lot of capital intensive, like threshers and harvesters. They had a semi-perennial, access to irrigation, so they created these massive ponds on on the farm, and they were using drip harvesting, sort of very efficient, good people from the Faisalabad Agricultural University, etc. But you see those benefits, and they were USAID was helping them export their mangoes to Western markets. So all that stuff is happening, but from the rural poverty context, you see, uh, they had 400 or 500 daily wage women who were coming to the farm, who were being paid. They were being paid in a timely manner, but the wages that they were getting were no
Mm,
better than what they would get elsewhere on a farm. Now, and if you look at now, imagine me coming in as a corporate farmer in somewhere in Sindh or the Punjab, and you are a sizable landowner, and you have a let's say 50 acres, and you're farming, and you have, because you can't do it yourself, you and your sons, so you will have agri laborers, you might even have 4 or 5 sharecroppers who've been there for generations. Now if you get like someone who's extremely well known, who is entrepreneurial, and he gives you a check for 3 years to lease your land,
mm,
you just rather go
mm.
with him and just like forget about all
Yeah.
that headache of farming yourself. But then what happens is that you don't need those men who
Mm,
are farming,
mm,
you know, uh, and then those men don't have any jobs at the corporate farm.
mm,
So, that corporate farm was, it was basically using seasonal laborers who would come in from elsewhere. Again, they weren't really getting big bonuses like the management team was when, they were
mm,
incentivized.
mm,
So it is not really a rural poverty reduction strategy. The farm
mm.
does well. I mean, if it's keeping its books right, it can even on a self-assessment basis give money to the government. But there's so many leakages everywhere. It's not like the government is super efficiently then channeling that money into rural development. So you see, unfortunately, something like corporate farming also not delivering in terms of addressing this problem of the rural populace that doesn't really have anything else to do. I mean, they haven't been given the education, they don't have the economic opportunities. So then what do they do? And then simultaneously, there's pressure to increase efficiency, to increase exports, right? And growing crops that should not be grown in an ecological zone like Pakistan, like sugar, right? I mean, a tropical grass
Yeah.
essentially, very labor intensive, profitable
Yeah.
because of the way that
Yeah.
the permit Raj has been set up. But so I mean, there really has not been, in my view, the market mechanisms and the structural adjustment reforms and agricultural liberalization has not really been able to percolate down to the poorer segments of rural Pakistan, and in many other parts of the world. In fact, it has increased their plight.
That's actually a very great point, and I would like to highlight that we usually tend to use the jargon human-centric policies, where you put people in front of the policy, making sure that the end result is greater prosperity for those stakeholders. But corporate farming may not seem to really check the box in terms of, like you said, alleviating rural poverty, addressing the needs and the demands of those who currently are at the base of the pyramid, sadly and unfortunately. So what would be a key solution? How can we address this problem? Or like what are some of the measures that can be taken at least so that we're on the right trajectory? So I'm not looking for obviously, an end-to-end solution to the problem. There are multiple components, but what do you think? What can be done to make sure that we are treading on the right path?
So, I mean, some of these things are already there. It's a matter of sequencing. Some are very thorny issues, which have these deep-rooted vested interests, like trying to do land reform when the military has a sizable
Mm,
interest in agricultural land. I mean, still, yes, feudal families over time have, changed sort of where they draw the power from, but in the last several decades, you've had this irony was it Fanon who said to rule over land is to rule over people? Because when you did have these large parcels of land and, villages living there, I mean, those were captive vote banks. So, no wonder you'd see a feudal also being in the legislature. And he's not going to axe his own foot by doing land reform. So even when Bhutto did do it, I mean, all the sort of lacunas that were found in that process. And I think some lessons were learned by 77, Mubashir Hassan and others who were working with him at the time. But, that didn't have much time. I mean, some argue that he had sort of conceded, others argued that no, he was going to actually talk about, putting in place, which is so one suggestion, concrete suggestion in the present is try and implement a minimum wage for the Khet Mazdoor. I mean, these guys are literally, working for this, obviously no contract, and things like computerization of land records. I mean, the bank's been throwing money at it. I mean, since a while, not only in Pakistan, in so many other places. When you look at the digitization process, what that does is, it takes this. I mean, if you happen to see those handwritten manuals of the patwaris, right, digitizes them. But you see, the problem with that is that it is not trying to do a spot check to see how those records were managed, because those records, there's a lot of fabrication, there's a lot of creative accounting in there. You see, because the patwari doesn't even have an office. These now, I mean, turning to sort of some more conceptual issues, I mean, there's this whole discourse around Foucauldian discourse around the idea of corruption, right? How states with weak capacity sort of enable or tolerate corruption as a means for them to manifest themselves. Imagine, I mean, if you had to be a Pakistani cop, right, with a motorbike and standing 12 hours in the sun, and you couldn't take any bribes for coffee and tea, would you want to work that job?
Of
Right.
course not.
So Akhil Gupta spoke to this idea, right, of corruption and sort of agency so I think that one can't simply talk about, so Patwari does not have an office. So he's supposed to like find his own office. Often it's the larger landowner, right, who'll give him an office and send him tea. So he will, and these are very, I mean, I can't take names, but I know even very reputable people who have, they've been renting out their land because they're two columns. One is a cultivator, one is the owner. Often you'll see people, because they don't want a headache. So they will just say we self-cultivate, even when they don't. And the Patwari will put them as a self-cultivator when they are not. Because, if someone else has been cultivating for a while, you're obligated to first offer them the land, they have some rights over time, tenancy rights. So, to avoid that hassle, those land records are incorrect. Now, the idea was that when you make them transparent, they digitized, I can go in, give 100 rupees and get the record, and I'll be like, hey, this is not correct. I'll have this fixed. Transparency is going to lead to accuracy, but that is, again, blind to the power dynamics. I mean, if I'm like barely able to, survive, and I owe money to the landowner, even if I have that piece of paper, so what? What is that? It's the same way that, with Islamic laws, you have fine women don't get, the equal share, they're supposed to get half the property, right? I mean, family law, all of that. I mean, now you go to rural areas and you see how many brothers give half their property. And even that's complicated. Like I've actually asked people who, there was a Haji Saab somewhere in Gujarat. This is like a rich agrarian, it's not southern Punjab or, some part of Sindh where there's extreme poverty, very well-to-do, very politically aware, constituency. And he was a very nice person, with several sons and daughters. And I said to him that, Haji Saab, how come you're gonna give all your land to your sons and not to the girls? And he said, look, there. I mean, he said this jokingly, but look, when they get married, their brother would have done the same thing, right? So they will have access to some land. But, it's also look at the obligations placed on the brother,
mm,
right? I mean, where here in the West, can you imagine if you find the right person that you're going to defer gratification? You won't get
mm,
married till your sister's married. And you're going to
mm,
first put together money for her to get married before
mm,
you do your own. So, there you have to look at these things. You can't look at them in a piecemeal manner and then just like
mm,
reinforce tropes. So, so I mean, but at the end of the day, there is social ostracization. Women will go to the Patwari and say, we've gifted our land to our brother. He sold
mm,
it to us. I mean, the good brothers will send grain to their sisters, but
mm.
women are not, they are not managing land. And these are women whose families can afford to give them land. I mean, some do
Mm.
very rarely, but if you look at land
The,
ownership by women,
yeah.
you'll see what a glaring omission there is, even of Islamic law.
Well, this is actually very insightful to know, and it tends to take us away from just the economic aspect, and like you said, it highlights the social aspect, the sociological aspects of how these land reforms have been dealt with, and how these practices tend to be, reinvigorated, leading to gaps in productivity and rural poverty. So now, when we talk about land, we cannot not talk about the fact how we have finite resources. There's a finite amount of land within the confines of any nation's national boundaries. And in Pakistan, we see that there's been a lot of shift towards real estate, which is now hinging on land that used to be agricultural land solely. A couple of years ago, there was these Aam ke Baghat in Multan in South Punjab that they were taken over by the army, and there are plans to set up housing societies and housing authorities. And even at the individual level, we see that it's not just an institutional phenomena. The incentives are such that the common man would want to invest in real estate, and real estate itself is a non-productive asset. It does not contribute anything towards the country's exports, and it leads to further turmoil like the balance of payment crisis that we're facing. Army again tends to be a huge stakeholder. It has huge stakes. There's a lot of investment. It has a lot of ownership. How do we recalibrate, bring that back into balance? I mean, how would you categorize how big of an issue that is? And I don't think there's much argument. But then, which direction are we heading? It seems very abysmal.
Yeah, I mean, very unfortunate. A lot of urban planners have been talking about, Arif Hassan and others. So, I mean, rather than having, thinking vertical, which is what usually urban areas do, we think horizontal. So, there's the unregulated slum areas issue, which is a beast of its own. And then you have these housing colonies now. I mean, the uh, the phenomena of sort of the
The,
DHAs,
the
but
DHA
even
is, yeah.
right and otherwise, and these various the colonies, the barrier colonies and whatnot, right? And these are encroaching on cultivable land. There is these people face eviction. They don't get the kind of remuneration they should. It then adds to the cost of bringing produce to the mega cities. Like, the more sort of spread you have, the further then you have to go to procure. So I mean, that has environmental concerns affiliated with it, but it's unproductive. Yeah, this use of land is unproductive, and I mean, it's something that we unfortunately have seen, one foot forward, 1 foot back. I mean, look at the sort of the hoo-ha around the tree tsunami, etc., but also the Ravi River project, which a lot of NGOs had been talking about, because these sort of trying to build this, like, new
Yeah.
city by the water of the Ravi, which meant, I mean, and already we've seen evictions of people from there, right? And the government is thinking of this. I mean, they're thinking dollar bills in front of their eyes, but the sort of it has been not very considerate. I mean, this is like the WWF, etc., talking about the floodplains
Yeah.
and the potential damage it can cause, the evictions of of people, and there's a lot of unproductive use of land. I mean, the way that it goes. I mean, a lot of economists, Pakistani economists, Pied and others have been talking about this. So in the urban areas, certainly, there is no need for them to keep expanding in the way that they are, in that in that entirely unproductive way.
Perfect, perfect. So, and I'm assuming, given the vested power and it all comes down to political economy, the players are such that govern and administer the country itself because they find their incentives drawn from these policies and this expansion of urban land and housing societies. We don't see them taking a different stance. This is the reality, and which is very far from idealism. And just to end it on last, just I wanted to hear your last few words that we've studied this. We very often hear that Pakistan is an agrarian economy. Do you think that Pakistan can capitalize, still make sure that we maximize that, we're able to leverage that as a tool, as an instrument for uh, correcting our economy, for addressing our economic issues? Or should we try to move away from this idea, this intuition of Pakistan being an agricultural economy and transitioning towards a more industrialized state? How do you foresee that?
I think food sovereignty is an issue lest you have geological constraints, and Pakistan has none. There's still abundant water. I mean, we, degraded the soil, and a lot of it goes back to that hydraulic economy, the damming issue. But the market fixes. So, for instance, this whole idea of carbon trading and and using that now to restore the mangroves. I mean, fine, it's not susceptible to political pressures in that way. But when you have and there is some experience in other countries where if you're gonna like create these opportunities, these incentivized opportunities, how much will they be zones of exclusion, and how much will they be working in tandem with local communities and providing them the opportunities you need? So I mean, if I'm getting I'm doing carbon trading, is my foremost concern going to be how much of the mangroves, the saplings that I've planted survive, or how much fishermen can come in and eke out a living? So I think that there is, with things like carbon, it's a convenient
Yeah.
way out for these big giants that are slowly transitioning, right? But it is it's not, lest you pay close attention, and this is stuff that goes back to
Mm.
the 1990s human development, right? This idea that you gotta emphasize. So unless you're thinking bottom up, I mean, you have now with climate finance, if anything comes into the loss and damage fund, right? I mean, resources can become available, but it is, in our political economy, will they be operationalized, in a manner that, that is bottom up rather than top down? And unfortunately, in my view, hand in the market mechanism, the way that it's perpetuated by the international financial system with the lending schemes, fits very nicely hand in glove with the elite-led economy in Pakistan. And we have seen that certainly in the case of Pakistan and many other places. And that is something that then needs to be, we need to think of the bigger picture, because you can't just like cut a
Mm.
slice of reality and finger point,
Mm.
which is again what we often do. Like the poor countries, the corrupt countries, the inefficient countries, they are locked into this global
Yeah.
political economy where there's a race to the bottom of the
Mm.
barrel, right? And that needs to be acknowledged, and one needs to be able to sort of be reflexive. Otherwise it's just like conveniently blaming the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And the weakness in the gaps are so evident, so visible just by the mere fact that 4 out of the last 6 years we've had to import wheat to satisfy the demands of a local population speaks volume about the current state of affairs. But no, thank you so much for your time. I think it was great to learn from you, and I very much highly recommend to our listeners, to our audience, to who are interested in the topic, to read your book. It's called Development, Poverty, and Politics in Pakistan. Sorry, Development, Poverty, and Power in Pakistan. And it has some key learnings, and you've done a lot of field research. And I had the chance to go through it, and I think it's a gold mine of knowledge. On that note, thank you so much. It was lovely having you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.